This is the second in our constituted cloud track, second event. First, let me point out Rose Klimovich. Rose organizes this track, so she moderated the last one and will be organizing the future cloud events. And so we certainly appreciate her efforts in pulling together the speaker and the topic and so forth. So, and with that, Andrew.
Thanks. Can everybody hear me in the back? You okay? All right. No? No. Can you hear me now? All right. I'm Andrew Nuska. I'm an editor at ZDNet, the business technology publication. I want to thank the council for having us. They've been really awesome in putting this all together. I mean, look at us. We're all here. That's pretty cool. It's not easy to move this many people. So, thank you to them. We're going to run through a round of introductions very quickly, and then we're going to dive right in. I just want to point out it's just delightful to have this panel on a cloudy day. Because it's really hard to talk about the cloud when it's bright and sunny outside. So it's very apt. If you don't mind, panelists, could you just run down the row and introduce yourselves, and then we'll dive into questions, shall we?
Sure. So I'm Jim Anthony. I'm the VP of Sales Engineering for Verizon Terramark. I've got a team of folks around the world that basically work with our sales teams to construct solutions for clients that are looking to solve some IT problems that they've got.
I'm Sheila Montgomery. I'm an Executive Vice President of Sales at QTS. QTS is a data center and managed hosting company. We're privately held and have about just under 4 million square feet of data center under management.
I'm Eric Rosenkrantz with Microsoft, and I'm with our server and tools business as Director of Business Development for financial services and government globally. So certainly looking at both on-premise and cloud and everything in between, and happy to be here.
And I'm Bill Whelpley. I look after a team of business development folks in IBM Global Services, the solution things for cloud situations for our enterprise customers across North America.
Thanks, guys. So I want to start off really basic. A few questions were posted with the invitation on the council's website, and I want to start off with those because I think they're a nice primer, and then we can get into more deeper paths as we go along. And later on, I'll open it up for questions. If you have specific ones, we've got a nice array. We've got a nice mix of expertise here, so feel free to ask questions when we get to that point. All right. So the first one's an easy one. How do you know which architecture is right for you? You've got the public cloud, the private cloud, the hybrid cloud in the middle. How do you know which one's right?
Well, I think, like a lot of things in the world, it has to do with personal preference. My take on this is that a good place to start is definitions, right? And excuse me, public cloud really is a great place if you need to put something up quickly, take it down quickly, you want to have public access to it on the internet, you want to have self-service. But if you have requirements around compliance and security and performance, then I think that's going to dictate how much you push to either to private cloud. And so I think it's really a function of what you're using it for and what your own tolerance level is for risk and price.
So, jump in just real quick. So just to dovetail on that, so from a Verizon Terramark perspective, I think some of the things that our customers would talk about really are, what are the business problems that you're trying to solve? Is it a data center capacity issue? Is it a power issue? Is it a natural disaster potential issue? Right, hurricanes or thunderstorms or tornadoes or whatever. So from that perspective, what are the business things that you're trying to figure out and solve for? And then back to what was originally said, What are the things that you're comfortable with and the constraints that you have to operate within? What industry are you in? What are you Sarbanes-Oxley compliant? You PCI requirements? FISMA moderate, things like that, security-based requirements, or other audit and control that you might have to live up to. That'll help you dictate kind of which platform, whether it's private, public, or virtual private. And Verizon Terramark's got several different platforms that I'll try to stay away from the generic terms and actually use, multi-tenant versus single tenant versus on-prem versus remotely deployed, those kinds of things as I give future responses. But that just to dovetail on that, that's what I would add in.
I would also say that so in my conversations with folks that are part of startups, for example, their assumption is they're going to the public cloud first because the economics there are clearly demonstrated to be beneficial. But you start there and then you start working against the risk profile. And so as was mentioned earlier, you've got multiple cuts at risk. You've got a privacy cut in terms of is there a PII set of data within the application or the workload that really would have an added risk profile by going to the public cloud. You've got the behavior of the workload or the application itself. Is it a highly chatty application that really would benefit from close proximity to an on-premise implementation, and what other dependencies does it have with other applications that may be geographically housed in one place that are not in the public cloud? Then you've got a regulatory cut. So if you're a large, highly regulated bank and you have desires to have the economics of a startup, but you have the reality of OCC regulators sitting in your environment, it's a longer term decision and a completely different risk profile than if you were a startup without all those constraints. So I would say the economics are clearly demonstrated, and it's really about figuring out which workloads can aim for those economics despite all the filters that I mentioned.
I think that when we talk to clients about architectures, we frequently are starting from the presumption that we're talking about infrastructure services. And IBM clearly differentiates between infrastructure services and some of the other as-a-service layers that may be in the marketplace. And depending on what the nature of the workload is, there may be a different architecture for the same workload that applies if you're talking about an infrastructure service versus a software as a service delivery model. And both of them are valid. Both of them can be accommodated in either a public or a private, and increasingly in a hybrid kind of a deployment. But the requirements are different depending on whether you're talking about the software as a service layer or the infrastructure as a service layer when you're talking about the cloud that you're trying to solution for.
That's a nice overview, guys. Jim, you mentioned in your response, you covered some of these particular cases. You mentioned disaster recovery, which resonated with me. I remembered, the hurricane here.
A little storm y'all had.
There were a few data centers down there, not so good, and they weren't ready for it. And also, we talked about security as well. Can you talk a bit about some of those use cases and trying to manage across that?
Absolutely. So at Verizon Terramark, we are absolutely focused on infrastructure as a service, just like IBM is. That's really where we play. We don't offer software as a service or platform as a service sort of products and capabilities. So from an infrastructure as a service perspective, that's what I can bring to the table. Infrastructure that backends the cloud is the same infrastructure that you all have in your own data centers today. They might be under your desk, they might be in an air-conditioned room, or they might be in a closet at the end of the hall. But it's the same infrastructure. It's the same computers, networks, storage. That infrastructure has to be deployed and managed and maintained in a safe and secure environment. You've got to be able to put cooling on it. It's got to have the right electricity, multiple power feeds, multiple providers of electricity, if you can get that in the location you're in. So that's a critical component. When it comes to making decisions about deploying cloud technology, especially if you're talking about a multi-tenant platform or a public platform, to use your nomenclature, that thing can't go down. It just simply can't go down. So you have to be able to build redundancies into it and offer those redundancies at an affordable level, right? So it starts with the data center. So this equipment is deployed in a data center that's got physical infrastructure, air conditioning units, power distribution units, and all the things that are required to make a data center operate. But that data center also has to be protected from a physical security perspective. So you think about armed guards and badge readers and scanners and logbooks to figure out who's going in and out of the facility. And so just because you're buying into the cloud, especially at an infrastructure as a service layer, doesn't mean that you can forego all of that. You have to think about it when you're making vendor selections and choices, because the infrastructure that is used to deploy the cloud platform, it can quickly become the weak link if you don't think about it. Once you analyze it, look at it, figure out, does this pass muster, then you let the service provider take care of it, right? That's their responsibility. That's why they exist. I can go get focused then on my applications and the other things that I want to deploy there. When it comes to disasters, natural disasters, earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, and things like that, some of them appear everywhere, but some of them are isolated to certain locations. And one of our flagship data centers is in Miami. And everyone, the first reaction is, well, Miami, why would you build a data center in Miami? Well, if you saw the data center, you would understand that it was architected to withstand hurricanes. We've actually been hit by 6 hurricanes, and we've never suffered an outage because of the hurricanes. So we offer 100% SLA in the environment. But the point is that it was actually architected to withstand Category 5 direct hit on that facility. And because of the way we designed it and built it and the way that we operate it, it's actually on the federal infrastructure list of critical infrastructure during a time of emergency. So we sort of go into a lockdown mode when a hurricane's approaching Miami. We deploy people into the facility. The federal agencies show up. They have people in the facility. We actually become a point of sanity around all the insanity that's going on with the weather hitting the area, to the point where we can actually pump fuel back out to hospitals and police stations and things like that. So you really have to take a look at, if you're trying to solve for problems like natural disasters, you really have to take a look at the provider that you're investigating to figure out, have they thought about these things? Are they going to handle a direct hit from a hurricane? Are they going to handle an earthquake, which you may never get here, but in other parts of the country you will? Or how about tornadoes? Let's think about some of those things. Snowstorms. How do you handle snow on the roof? How much is too much, right? So anyway, that's just some of my thoughts.
Those 6 hurricanes, that was in one season, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
2004. There was a lot of them that came through Miami that year.
Yeah. Do you guys have anything to say about disasters in particular? There are a few things you all said that I want to touch on, but I don't want to move on until we've kind of exhausted the...
Well, the only thing I'd like to add about the disasters, and it again dovetails nicely with what Jim was saying, is just when you're comparing public and private clouds, one of the things I find when I talk to clients who are using public-facing clouds for a lot of reasons is that they actually don't know where their data lives, right? They don't even know what state it's in. And that's okay if the data that they have on there isn't critical to, if it can go down. And I would assume that in most cases, companies are making those decisions. Again, we talked about risk profiles. But when you're making decisions around critical data, for your organization, then you do have to go through a lot of the steps that Jim was just talking about in terms of vetting exactly what kind of facility these are located in and how they are structured to take care of disasters and respond to them.
Cool. I saw you nodding your head, yeah.
I would also say that there's a general concern about public cloud until folks start to really drill down and look at all the steps that and I'm speaking through the lens of Microsoft here, that all the steps that we take to make sure that we've got continuity of operations in mind. And in fact, the reaction that we get when we actually lift the hood and show folks what we're doing is, you're doing a lot more than we do in our own private cloud on premise. So from a continuity of operations perspective, we actually gain credibility when we pop the hood and say, here's everything that we're doing as a company to maintain reliability at a global scale. And the reaction in many cases is, wow, that we hadn't thought of that list of things that you do. We hadn't thought of a lot of them just because we've been focused through our own lens. As a public cloud provider, and I'm sure the experience is similar for the other public cloud providers here, whether it's infrastructure as a service or platform as a service, you have not just end customers who are deploying into those clouds, but you have ISVs and cloud service vendors as well that are building multi-tenant services on your cloud, and the notion of being reliable is absolutely paramount to the relationship with those groups. And SLAs is one thing, but reputation is another. So reputation, from a reputation perspective, we have to go figure out all those hard things to do and make sure that we're doing them and telling people about them as well, so that as they're making their decisions, they really understand what's going on under the hood.
I think that at IBM we would agree that the idea of going with a reputable provider is paramount. We see cloud services at any level as being a subset of the broader category of managed services, which may include business continuity services, it may include hosting services, it may include some sort of application migration services. So cloud is a specialized set of the broader category of managed services in this arena. And anybody who is providing any of these services for any length of time is going to experience some level of business continuity, either from events that are hitting them in their data centers, or in the course of serving their customers when their customers get hit by a disaster. And we've got as much experience as anybody does in the world at delivering on those services when those disasters do hit.
Now, when we went down the line before, Bill, Eric, you guys talked a little bit, you touched on very briefly cost, which is a different concern entirely. Can you guys expand on that? Because that's, what plays into that decision for you guys and the hybrid model?
Well, we look at the cost calculus as being one of understanding what your workload is and looking at the cost of managing that workload rather than necessarily the cost per CPU or cost per bit transmitted over the network. Because there's a lot of different elements in the current market around particularly infrastructure as a service that can play into some of the cost calculus. And it's not really a valuable comparison necessarily to always compare what the cost of someone's virtual machine is versus another virtual machine when you're talking about public or shared infrastructure services at the infrastructure layer. You need to think about what the overall cost of operating a particular application or workload is going to be if you're going to get a valid calibration of what it's going to cost you to do that. And given how inexpensive it is to run some of these workloads in a lot of these shared infrastructure environments for a short period of time, it's worthwhile gauging what your actual performance is for a particular workload in a provider's environment before you make the determination whether you're going to go with one or another.
Yeah, I would also say that there are consumption patterns that make a lot of sense for the cloud. So and most of us have probably either heard about them or read about them or experiencing them. But things like predictable bursting, unpredictable bursting, really making sure that you are using the actual capacity that you've purchased, and the cloud is the public cloud is a very elastic way to do that. We're seeing some of that also transition into the private cloud space, both in terms of infrastructure as a service and bringing more elasticity to clouds within an enterprise. But I would say that it also comes down to if you are an end customer that is looking at the cost of delivering line of business applications, it comes down to not just looking at the cost of moving one VM from a private cloud to that same VM in a public cloud, but really looking at your overall cost to deliver internally. I'd say it's probably even more important if you're an ISV looking to bring your application to the cloud and offer it as a multi-tenant service, because then you get into real discussions of the cogs underneath delivering your service to the market. And what we're finding and the ISVs that are moving with us to the cloud are finding that their cogs can go down dramatically because the price point at which we can deliver the underlying platform is far below what they could achieve on their own. So I'd say both of those perspectives, end customer looking at your own environment, and probably even more amplified is the the ISV that's looking at their COGS and how to deliver that to the cloud. In both of those scenarios, we're seeing a lot of uptake.
I have a real world example of a client that we have. So we had a client who allowed me to use their name, MD DataCore. They're a healthcare company, and they were using co-location with us for a while. And what ended up happening is that all of these regulations that are suddenly being imposed on them, HIPAA and such, were going to cost them millions of dollars to implement themselves. And they found that by moving to our cloud environment, which has been certified, actually allowed them to really avoid those costs. I mean, their monthly operating costs went up a little bit, but they avoided having to shell out a couple $1 million out of the gates. And so that's sort of an interesting example of how costs are really being saved.
I'm glad you used it. I love it when the customer anecdotes come in.
You're right.
Any feelings on cost, Jim?
Yeah, sure. So a couple points I'd like to make is that, first of all, the old adages that we're all used to in our regular lives outside of work, right, still apply. Nothing's free. Everything costs money. There's no doubt about it, despite what some providers would have you believe. If it's too good to be true, it probably is, right? So think about that as well. A lot of times people get bamboozled, and I like to use that word, but I think that's what was implied further down the table about sort of hidden costs or costs that aren't necessarily discussed. So don't get bamboozled. Think about all the things that have to happen, and what it really gets down to is understand, as a consumer of a cloud service, whether it's public, private, hybrid, multi-tenant, single-tenant, it doesn't matter. Understand where the delineation of responsibility occurs on the platform that you choose to go on or you're looking at going on. Who's responsible for the care and feeding of the underlying technology, the hardware, the network, the firewalls, the load balancers, the storage arrays, all that stuff? Who's responsible for patching the virtual machines that you want to deploy there? How's that going to be handled? Who's monitoring that stuff? And there's different answers depending on different vendors, right? I have an answer. These guys all have answers as well. But make sure you know, so you go into the decision head up, eyes open, right? And that needs to factor into your cost as well. So that's what I would add to the conversation.
Don't get bamboozled. Everybody got that? All right. We've been talking very broadly about kind of the structure and, what's appropriate. Let's get into it a little bit. What belongs in the cloud? What definitely should get out there? Put it out, it's fine. What has to stay in the data center? Now, I know this differs depending on the company and the use case. I mean, a medical company obviously has much different requirements than a company like mine, which is a media company. But nonetheless, are there some lessons? Are there some kind of Cliff's Notes we can take on, definitely put it in the cloud, definitely keep it in the data center, and so forth? We're going to roll right back down.
Sure. So let's talk about what cloud really does mean, right? So first of all, cloud really talks about virtualization. Virtualization sits on typically hypervisor-oriented platforms, right? These hypervisor-oriented platforms typically sit on Intel and AMD processors. So one of the first things you got to get your head around is, my applications, do they run on Intel and AMD operating systems? Do they run on Windows and Linux and things like that, versus other operating systems that aren't necessarily, Intel or AMD oriented? Now, there's exceptions. There's other operating systems that have logical partitioning and other things that you could actually take advantage of. But most of the cloud platforms out there aren't necessarily built on those technologies. So that's one thing you got to think about. The next thing you got to think about is the applications that I have. Are they 100% virtualizable? Can all the components of the application run on virtual machines, which is really what cloud's all about, right? Or do they have a mixture? Are there certain components of the app that, either because of the operating system that they're based on, or some of the technology that's required, or some of the throughput that's required, are there some components that can't be virtualized? Take, for example, my example for this is always the refrigerator-sized Oracle rack cluster, right? It's just, everyone can visualize that with the massive storage array off to the back, and I got to get 1 million IOs per second through that thing. I'm not virtualizing that no matter what, right? Well, okay, so can the service provider or the solution that you're looking at, again, whether it's private or public, can they handle some sort of deployment within the facility and safely cross-connect that refrigerator-sized Oracle rack cluster with the cloud services, so that I might be able to take advantage of cloud services where it makes sense and not unnaturally force something into the cloud that probably shouldn't be moved in there anyway. So think about that concept. Another thing that I bring up a lot is how important is the application and what are the end users that are using the application. For example, in our scenario, the Verizon TerraMark scenario, we have massive connectivity into our facilities, right? If your application has eyeballs and end users that are in random places throughout the world, I can guarantee you're going to get better performance being on the backbone of the internet instead of being on the backwater of the internet, with a couple of connections to the internet wherever your home office is. So if your end users are eyeballs randomly scattered throughout the world or throughout certain places in the world, you're going to get good performance because we're right there in the major hubs of the internet. On the other hand, if your end users are internal and they're sitting at desks in your office, and you've got a great Verizon MPLS network tying all your offices together, and that's a use case. It might make sense to actually think about leaving that application in-house, especially if that application feeds other applications, right? You're collecting data from your phone system application, but you're actually reporting against it and using it in your financial apps or your production apps. It might make good sense to think about leaving all those tied together so the latency between the applications is unaffected by whether you virtualize or not. So all of these things need to go in the decision-making process.
So, at the beginning, Jim, the very first question Jim answered with, what does the business need? And so I think, unfortunately, every question you ask, I'm probably going to answer with, well, it depends on the customer, right? And essentially, at the end of the day, what should go on the cloud? Well, I can just tell you that a lot of my clients, why are they going to the cloud? Well, they're going to the cloud, one, because of cost. Two, because they want to have speed to market. They want to be able to get out there really quickly and be able to do some things they might not be able to do in a dedicated environment. But then they're sometimes restricted by the compliance issues and security issues and all the other stuff that we talked about. You like examples? So I'll give you another one. We have a global bank who works with us on a variety of product levels, and these guys, they're a bank, right? And they and what they've done is they've taken all of their data and they've compartmentalized it, and they've decided there's some data that absolutely must live in a building they own, period. There's no question about it. Then they have data that they feel comfortable putting in a building that they're leasing but still managing. And then they have data that they're comfortable putting in a consumption model like this. So again, I think it comes down to every company deciding what they're going to do. I will tell you that, especially as it relates to hybrid, we're seeing a lot of companies, what they really want to do is leverage the investment they've already made with the ability to do these new things. And so that's why you're seeing so much hybrid out there, because they want to put their toe in the water, we want to be able to try new things, but if you've already invested millions of dollars in something, you're not going to throw it away tomorrow just because you want some of these newfangled gadgets. So again, for me, it comes down to personal choice.
Sure.
So I would say, and it was mentioned earlier, that defining what the cloud is. For us, we've got a pretty broad definition of what the cloud means. We're a SaaS provider with things like Office 365. We've got a platform as a service play with Azure. We've got an infrastructure as a service play with Azure. We also have a long history of providing on-premise private cloud implementations as well. So all of those things are in the portfolio. And what we're seeing, and I'll use government as an example here, the aspirational vision in government, and many of us have probably read about cloud first. So the aspirational vision is, because of economics, the cloud should be considered first and then managed. If you're standing up a new workload or if you're modernizing your portfolio, consider the cloud first, because it really has the economics that can't be matched with an on-premise implementation. But that said, then manage by exception and look at risk-based decisions around workloads, look at application behavior, and that we think is a good aspirational vision, because we do fundamentally believe in the economics of the public cloud, but we also recognize that there are these cuts at reasons why a hybrid architecture can really be a good end state for lots of customers, lots of partners that are developing multi-tenant solutions. So it really comes back to fundamentally believing in the economics of the public cloud, Also realizing and accepting the fact and embracing the fact that a hybrid architecture is a really good end state for lots of different scenarios, and being able to move workloads back and forth with a common management layer is a very desirable state, and that's really summed up in our world under what we call the cloud OS vision. So a cloud OS being an OS that spans on-premise through the cloud and the ability to manage and across both ends of the spectrum. And really the filters, really the aspirational vision is around cost, agility, and elasticity across that cloud OS vision.
Yeah, I want to start by, with all due respect to Jim and the guys at Terramark, x86 is not the only architecture that virtualizes. We have a rather robust business in Power and Z-Series that we put in the cloud, and it's actually very good. But virtualization is an important attribute of cloud. There are a couple of other attributes of cloud that differentiate it, whether you're talking about any of the layers of service, infrastructure through software, that are common attributes to each one of those layers, one of which is elasticity of demand. And today, a workload is not really a good candidate for cloud services unless it displays some elasticity of demand. And that's, to us, that means private or public or hybrid. And the biggest use case we see for hybrid these days is bursting. So there's folks who are operating some sort of an environment in their own data center today, but they would like to budget for their average utilization around that environment and be able to acquire additional resources when they have additional capacity requirements, whether those are predictable and seasonal and they can contract for them, or they're unpredictable and they want to be able to get those kinds of things on demand. Some of the other elements that go into deciding whether an application is a good candidate for cloud have to do with software licensing. And software licensing is a big issue for any of the providers, including IBM. In that we don't want to necessarily kill our software business by saying we can easily translate it down into all clouds all the time. But depending on what your application portfolio looks like, and whether you're using packaged applications or you're using in-house developed applications, licensing costs and the licensing costs for the software in a cloud, private or public, can have a big influence on whether you move into that virtualized elastic demand kind of an environment or not. And there's at least one vendor who's not represented at the table here who has a relatively unenlightened view of licensing and licensing in a virtualized world. And because of that, they're struggling a little bit with getting those applications moved into what we would call a cloud environment.
Taking swings down there, Bill.
Quite that great.
Two of them. No. Is there any application that could go in both? You know, that could be in more than one state, the private and
Most.
You're comfortable with that? That's
Yeah,
fine.
we're very comfortable with that. Again, it's a matter of, for us, the services you're trying to consume and the nature of the application. So infrastructure as a service may have a different use profile than if you're trying to run a middleware executable environment, a platform environment, or a complete software stack, and try to burst between those kinds of worlds. The underlying management and governance infrastructure that's required to support those different layers of burst mode are quite different. And there's a lot of those applications or workloads that would work quite comfortably in a hybrid environment. In fact, I've had at least one CIO tell me that it's going to take us a long time to get the first application into a cloud. But once the first one goes, everything's a candidate.
That's interesting.
I would also say that one sort of one sort of set of workloads that is a good candidate for a hybrid environment is a workload that has PII involved. So you may have some some elements that are very compute-centric that would, from an economic perspective, you'd love to put them in the public cloud, but then you've got data that's part of that workload that really is deemed high risk. There's a PII masking pattern that I've seen folks go toward that says, hey, we'll keep the PII on premise, but we will mask that PII and abstract that PII from the actual compute-intensive tasks and go do those in the cloud and then marry the results back on premise. And that's just one example of, it's not specific to one particular industry. It really spans many different industries. That's an example of where a hybrid environment really adds value. You get some of the economic benefits of the public cloud. You get to, as was mentioned earlier, you get to keep some of the data within your walls, and you can feel good about that, and you can satisfy regulators if that's needed. But you take advantage of some of the benefits of both ends of the spectrum.
Speaking of data within walls, what are some of the factors that would make a company want to run its own data center? Can anybody speak to that?
At some point, there's just economies of scale that make sense for people to continue to operate their own data center. But that may not apply to all workloads that the enterprise necessarily has to support.
Yeah.
So there may be more logic to taking some of your more highly elastic workloads, and rather than having those sit on resources that are for 8% of the time just burning clock cycles, taking those out and putting them into someone who can provide on-demand kinds of resources. And that would probably make more economic sense than operating yourself.
The only thing I would disagree with is I'm not sure that that there's ever economies of scale that make it sense to have your own data center. And this comes from a company that does outsource data centers, so take it with a grain of salt. But I do. For me, again, I find to me, I still think it's a psychological choice more than anything else. And in great part, I saw this happen with banks, right? In 2004, 5, 6, you talk to banks, they'd say, there's no way on God's green earth I'm ever giving you my data. 2009 rolls around, they suddenly decide that it's way too expensive for them to do it. Now, all of a sudden, they're all willing to outsource their data centers. So I would argue that they, there's a good argument to do it, but when they choose not to, and I even see really small companies who will put their foot down and say, I must own my own data center. To me, that's all psychological, and it doesn't have anything to do with it.
I would agree with that too. So again, coming from a data center provider as well, there are definitely some reasons that people want to continue to run and own and operate their own data centers. And I would say the primary one is fear. They're afraid of not doing that, right? So, and that's okay. That's a valid reason. And there's tied to that is security concerns and compliance and other things that go with it. I think there are really valid reasons that are brought up periodically. And like I mentioned earlier, an application where the end users are literally right there around the infrastructure, and it's a high performing application. They need instantaneous access to whatever. Call it voice, call it popping screens of customer information, whatever it is. Perhaps that's a very good example of why you would want to leave something right there within, nearby in proximity to the end users. I would say there's also compounding on fear. There's experience. A lot of times companies will move to an externally hosted data center or external provider, and they have a bad experience and they pull it back in-house. So that's a real deal, and we see that a lot in the environment, in the market. So anyway, I just wanted to add that as well. So I think fear is the biggest factor of leaving stuff in your data center.
I think pulling in the other direction, though, is the fact that, and I'll speak of the public sector, for example, where a lot of governments simply don't have the money to continue operating their own data center, and I think that's what is going to break the fear. At some point, that will enable them to overcome the fear, because they literally will have to make a decision as to whether they want to start to degrade the number of services they provide, or whether they're willing to take some smart risks around moving workloads that may have been completely off the table to move to the public cloud before, but with really popping the hood on looking at the ways you can manage that risk and take advantage of the public cloud economics. I think that over the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see more of that kind of thinking in terms of, hey, I just can't afford to operate my own data center. Even if I am afraid for whatever reason emotionally of the public cloud, it's no longer an emotional issue because I can't afford to do it anymore.
Interesting. Sheila, you said something earlier that stuck with me about the hybrid cloud being an endpoint versus the next step. Just a few questions ago. Can you elaborate on that? Is there anybody obvious for whom that the hybrid cloud is clearly the way to be versus a step to something else, and if so, what? Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. So I certainly wouldn't want to imply that hybrid is the endpoint for everyone, or obviously, because we've got lots of examples in our own client base where we've actually successfully had migrations from colo to full cloud, and they're very happy and are no longer hybrid. But again, I think that what I think my point in saying that was simply that I believe hybrid cloud will be around for a while. And by a while, I mean 3 years, right? For me, you can't see past 3 years in technology. I have no idea we'll be, thinking all of this, the cloud will be in the air or something like that. But for all we know. So my point is simply that I think, these kinds of transitions take a very long time. I mean, I think a lot of us were around when they were talking about utility computing, right, in 2000. And so these transitions take a while, and the people who take the longest are our clients. And again, I think there's still 80% of clients still host their data in their own closets down the hall. This with things like, Superstorm Sandy coming along. So I just think that what you'll see is, I know for a fact the vast majority of companies out there see cloud as a major project in the next 12 months. I think there was a Tier 1 research study that said 42% of their surveyed respondents said that it was one of their top 2 projects in the next 12 months. That's a lot of people focused on the cloud. So there's no question that everyone's dipping their toe in. But I think that it would be a lot to expect that they're all going to jump right in, especially, as I mentioned before, with sort of an existing investment, that type of thing.
Thanks. Anybody else want to expand on that, or shall we move on?
I would just say that we believe that the hybrid environment is an endpoint. It's not just an interim state for the next couple years, because there are, I think we mentioned a number of these cases earlier, but there are a number of design patterns that actually fit quite well in a hybrid environment, and that make sense to keep in that state. While borrowing the economic benefits of the public cloud and marrying up with some of the benefits of the private cloud environment, and making sure that you can manage smoothly across the two. So that's clearly where we're headed as a company, is really keeping that, fundamentally believing in the economics of the public cloud, but also believing the fact that we need to be able to very seamlessly support a hybrid environment.
Thank you very much.
You might be surprised at this, but we manufacture a lot of data center hardware and software, and so we have an interest in making sure that there's some amount of private cloud and proprietary infrastructure that continues to exist past the next 3 years.
Wait, you're with who again?
Yeah.
Never heard of him.
It's still quite a robust business.
That actually dovetails nicely with my next question, which was every time we at ZDNet write about the hybrid cloud, there's always this other term that's not far behind, the integrated appliance. Does anybody want to speak to that? What is it? Is it overhyped? Is it really the be-all, end-all?
Well,
what's the hardware side of things? We've been talking a lot about strategy.
Since I presume you're talking about, in our case, pure systems, the integrated appliance is less of an appliance, because it's not quite as simple as a toaster, but it's an expert integrated system, which allows you to bring up a complete environment that's optimized for a particular workload or set of workloads rapidly. So rather than spending weeks or months on integration of complete underlying hardware infrastructure and then middleware execution environments. It's all pre-integrated in the factory. It comes and lands on the data center floor and allows you to bring up a particular workload very rapidly and very efficiently. It's got all the kind of attributes of cloud baked in. Metering, so you can provide chargeback on the workload. It's got self-service, so there's portals to allow people to do automated self-provisioning of the resources out of the expert integrated system. It's got dynamic provisioning of resources inside of the box. And we see that as being strategically something that's going to be very important for hybrid environments, in the sense that we have that for the on-site dedicated kind of an environment. We also have the virtualized version of that in our public cloud. So you can do an abstraction away from just the infrastructure as a service capability and begin to talk about integrating at a platform layer or a software as a service layer and have those services move back and forth between your internal environment and your external environment. That's not an easy thing to get done. And I wouldn't even want to represent to anybody that all of the kinks to being able to move workload back and forth for all classes of workload are completely worked out yet. But we've got enough use cases and enough interest from our client base to know that that's where an awful lot of the interest in what IBM is doing in the cloud space is focused on.
Does anybody else have any thoughts on these kind of Uber boxes and their role in the whole setup? No? I'll let him handle it? All right. Well, we've been moving at a nice clip, I must say, so thank you all. Let's see here. How about automation? We touched on that very briefly, but, are we far enough along that we can manage the balance between public and private? Let's kind of do a status update on automation. How's that functioning? You want to take it?
Yeah, sure.
Shake your head.
So typically, in the world that I live in, automation is going to be achieved through the adoption of APIs, right? So cloud providers make APIs available to their infrastructure and their service that they offer. And then it's the adoption of those APIs that make the difference in the world in terms of automation. You can certainly use a mouse and drive a portal and click and point and say, I want to build a machine and build another machine with these characteristics. You can absolutely do it much more rapidly through programmatic API calls. Once you figure out the API concept, and many of our customers have and many of our partners have, they can actually then go and layer on their own tools, their own automation technologies, their own workflow on top of those APIs to allow the approval process internally. Once the approval is hit, it actually can trigger the execution of spin up 10 servers, spin up 20 servers, do what I need to do. So I would say that in terms of where are we in the life cycle of automation, we're absolutely, call it in our teenage years, our early 20s, if you will, in terms of how long it's been around. It's not impossible. It's very much out there. It's very much in use today by a lot of companies. Think about other things. There's a lot of noise now around big data and other concepts that are really kicking in. Some of those concepts wouldn't exist without cloud automation. So the idea of being able to spin up hundreds or thousands of virtual machines to handle a certain kind of workload, you're only going to do this through automation. And so, we're already seeing the next wave after the cloud come down the road, and there's going to be more things after that. And it's all going to be paramount on automation.
Sure. Folks?
It's a little bit out of my area, but I think that one of the things that we've seen, and I agree with everything that Jim just said, in terms of it being important, it's certainly important to our clients. They're pushing us to do it a lot. We're seeing a lot of success when we keep stuff in a vendor environment, in a vendor ecosystem. It's much easier to do, but when you're integrating a lot of different systems, we're still a little ways off from making that happen super easily.
So one area where we look at the world through a slightly different lens than Jim mentioned is we look a little higher in the stack in terms of platform as a service, for example. So, certainly from an infrastructure as a service perspective, there's the ability to have a set of common management tools that can help you manage your on-premise environment all the way through your public cloud and be able to slide workloads back and forth based on the desire to do so or based on the need to do so. But then from a platform as a service perspective, it becomes about the productivity of the developers and really making sure that you can drive efficiencies into the way new applications are developed and provisioned and take a lot of time out of the cycle of starting to develop something to getting it fully deployed into production. So to the extent from a platform as a service perspective, you can provide much of the plumbing to make that job easier for developers, and then still use a common set of management tools across your entire extended cloud, on-premise and public cloud. You can simplify management of VMs, but you can also make the developers' world a lot easier and compress the time to get a new application up, and that can have real business impact in terms of time to market. If you've got a line of business user that needs to get something to market quickly, and you can now tell them that you can deliver twice as fast as you might have done a year earlier, there's real advantage to that, and that really drives to the efficiency point.
So I think it's worth differentiating between automated provisioning and workload orchestration with instrumentation built into it. And I agree with Jim. We're fairly mature when it comes to automated provisioning of resources in an environment. There's lots of partners out there that would work with any of the folks that are up here on the table and allow for automated provisioning of infrastructure in your own environment and one of our environments, or between our environments if you chose to do that. Where we're seeing the next turn of the crank take place is at the workload orchestration. So you begin to instrument the workload for cloud operations. And as Eric was saying, begin to look at how you can move elements of the workload at a platform level back and forth between one or more providers, or between an internal environment and an external environment, in order to optimize either the economics or the performance of the environment that you're operating with. And that gets back to the expert integrated system concept, where you at that point are introducing patterns of applications or patterns of workload that you need to manage as a complete group rather than as individual images or instantiations of a particular virtual machine. And if you're instrumenting those patterns and manage them as a complete set, and beginning to automate either the performance or the economics or some combination of the two of that complete set of patterns, you're really beginning to realize some of the benefit of what's going on in cloud. And in that regard, we're still very much early on into the environment for general purpose applications. There are some applications that exist in a cloud environment that are completely instrumented end to end and get that high level of orchestration around management of the resources that are required to run that workload. Netflix is an obvious example of an excellent application that runs in a cloud and is wholly instrumented from one end to the other. But for general purpose enterprise applications, we're still very early on in the adoption and the ability to orchestrate the optimization of that workload in a hybrid or even just single cloud environment.
Thanks. So my final question before we go to Q&A is, well, it's really more of an order. Can you tell me some customer stories that might be educational for our crowd here? Sheila indulged us with a few. Does anybody have any that the folks here can take away for their businesses? Top of mind.
Great use of the cloud, right? So we've got a customer that's been on board for several years now. I won't say the company name. You've probably never heard of them anyway. But they create software that runs and provides social interaction on Xbox games. So you might go home, kids might crank up the Xbox, play Guitar Hero, or some other game similar to that, and they might want to play with little Johnny across the street, or somebody on the other side of the city, or somebody on the other side of the planet. And they do this through a module within the game itself. Well, that's got to use internet connectivity. It's got to be able to be managed somewhere. There's a company that actually makes that software and runs on our cloud platform. And you think, well, that's interesting. So one interesting concept is that company never knows if a game that they're tied to is going to go viral, so to speak. They don't know how popular these games are going to be when they're initially released. But when Guitar Hero goes viral, they want to be able to have the capacity to be able to deal with it, right? So that's one concept. So their sustained utilization rate is ever increasing until the popularity of the game wanes. But there's also another concept that snowstorm arrives in New York City or Boston, like it has recently, right?
Never
and
happens here.
Millions of kids are suddenly at home, and all of a sudden, overnight, they need instantaneous capacity to be able to handle all these kids wanting to play Guitar Hero. And so another great use of the cloud, so this burstability, the idea of the provider having the capability of handling that workload as it's being generated by Mother Nature effectively is another great use case. So that's just one example I'd throw out there.
Guitar Hero and snowstorms, pretty good. Eric?
So I'll talk about one of my favorite projects over the last 6 months. So we had a project with the North American Aerospace and Defense Command for probably what you could call one of the most mission critical applications on the face of the planet, which is the NORAD Santa Tracker application. So you have millions of kids and small kids and big kids around the world who rely on this to really know where Santa is during the present delivery time period. And so this to me was a great example of the power of the public cloud. So for me, I think about being dragged into a meeting and having my boss come have a team sit around the table and saying, hey, I want you to build an application for me. And so the first thing you start to do is ask questions about it. So, okay, how many users, what's the workload? And your boss says, plan for roughly 100 million users. It's got to be developed in a couple weeks. And all of a sudden you've got visions of building a new data center and cement trucks rolling in
of sugar plums dancing.
Sugar plums, yeah. Okay. But you start to think about 10, 15 years ago, how would you even build something like that? I mean, the measures of it, and you've got a plan for millions of users per second, and how do you possibly handle something like that and build it in just a couple weeks? And we actually did. We built it with a few partners, most of whom had never even seen Windows Azure before and used it to develop anything. And in a couple weeks, they actually built this application, and NORAD hit record numbers this year. So there were roughly 90 million page views, and most of this actually happened in a window of about 3 days. So we've got 90 million page views, and I think there's 20-something million unique users. And think about the cost of doing that without the public cloud. It just wouldn't be possible, especially in light of the fact that, oh, by the way, on December 26th, it gets torn down, and you don't need it again for another year. So the cost of doing that would, this gets back to the belief, the fundamental belief in the public cloud. That would not be possible. It's kind of a unique, it's kind of a unique example, but for us, it really demonstrates the power of the public cloud, the agility, and just the productivity that can be achieved. And it was also a goodwill venture for us, and it did not go down, and we did not disappoint any children this past year, so we're happy about it.
Bill, do you have any stories for us?
I have 3 very fast use cases that are interesting. First is a good example of where cloud can deliver real value and be beneficial economically. It's an insurance company based here in the East. They do all of their Monte Carlo simulation on our smart cloud service, and they basically bring an environment of several hundred virtual machines up. They roll dice for about 3 weeks and then they put it away. And they know exactly what they got at the end of it, and they put it away for the next quarter. So it's actually an excellent example of how you can use elasticity and not have to host that kind of an environment on your own data center where there's no proprietary information and no risk of anybody losing anything because these machines are literally just rolling dice. The second example is a healthcare payer for which we built a very large private cloud on their data center. And the motivation for doing that was that based on their internal procurement cycles for supporting the development and test operations, they were experiencing 50-plus days of wall clock time between the time that somebody provisioned or submitted an order to the time that they got the equipment on the floor. And we were able to take that averaging 59-day wall clock time down to a couple of minutes for getting access to resources. That provider actually extended that couple of minutes to a few days because they wanted to put a couple of manual checks in the automated process around provisioning. But we demonstrated that you could reduce the provisioning cycle down. That represents some pretty eye-popping ROI. In fact, they measured it as being triple-digit kinds of ROIs for making the investment in private cloud. The last is IBM, is its own use case. About half of our own product development is taking place on our smart cloud services today, compliant with our CIO's security constraints. And we are integrating between the external cloud, which we sell as a commercially available service, and the internal cloud for that product development activity today. So that the hybrid concept is working, and we're eating our own cooking in that context.
Cookie, that's nicer than dog food. All right, folks. Well, thanks for being so patient. Does anyone have a question for our illustrious panel? Sir, you were the first.
Yeah, if you don't mind, it wasn't mentioned before about HIPAA, and I was just wondering, is all your data centers HIPAA enabled or HIPAA compliant, A, and B? What about omnibus ruling? Are you there today, or will you be there when the deadline sets in on September 23rd?
So I think, and I'm not an expert on the HIPAA side of the house, but what I will tell you is that, there are HIPAA, like lots of compliance, it's a story about how the end user is going to handle data security and all those types of things. And so we play a part in that story. We're not the entire story. So when it comes to specifically for cloud product in particular, we make sure that that we're compliant on all the levels that we need to be. And I think that includes things like we have jump networks and those types of things. Those are the things that I think get expensive for companies to install themselves. I honestly don't know enough about the omnibus stuff, so I apologize. But I will tell you that on this particular product, we certainly are, and in our data centers themselves, we are as well.
Right. So from a Verizon Terramark perspective, agreed with the comments. You can't have a blanket HIPAA compliant statement for a data center or a service. Although when a customer comes at us with HIPAA requirements, we meet the service provider portion of those requirements, all the way to the point of signing the BAA so that we'll stand with the client during the audit process. And I also don't know what the omnibus ruling is going to do to what we do. So,
and we're in a similar position in that we do support the HIPAA BAA for those clients that do have that requirement. And I should also mention all of the various compliance elements of what we do with our public cloud are available in the Windows Azure Trust Center. So we push all that out, and it's all public facing and kept up to date so that folks can see, not just through the HIPAA lens, but in terms of other relevant compliance measures from a data center perspective or industry perspective are available in the Windows Azure Trust Center.
So IBM has services that allow us to sign the BAA and participate in the HIPAA compliance process. And we manage a lot of HIPAA workload from the infrastructure perspective all the way through, in some cases, manipulating and managing the data.
What about the omnibus ruling?
The omnibus ruling, it's one of those things where we can accommodate it with what we would call a custom solution, but we don't have anything that
So you don't have a design today?
No, it would be a custom solution, but we custom solution almost every kind of compliance you can imagine.
Thank you.
So,
Excuse me, can you talk about your biggest pain points from cost perspective and from a service creation or an agility perspective in turning up service outside of cost?
So biggest pain point from a cost perspective is the 750,000 square foot, 6-story tall data center that operates on a city block in downtown Miami. That's not cheap. When it comes to building data centers, you have to invest the money up front to build a structure like that, to be able to then house equipment, technology inside of it. So from that's a big cost of what we do. Subsequent to that, the cost of acquiring technology that's actually the back end of the cloud is another big component. I mean, we're under the same constraints that all of you guys are on. If you want to call and order a physical server, it takes a while for that thing to roll off the assembly line, right? So we have to manage the capacity of the underlying infrastructure, make sure we predict when we're going to need to grow it, where we're going to need to grow it. We have to get it funded, things like that. So those are pain points. What was the second part of your question?
Service creation.
So service creation, for us, the biggest pain point with service creation is location oriented. Where do we want to turn up cloud services where they don't currently exist in our world? For us, we have to go in and make sure that the data center is robust enough that we can offer 100% SLA on the power, the cooling, the environmentals, the security related to that facility. We also, even though we're owned by Verizon, we have to ensure that we have multiple paths to the internet from that facility. So we actually do deals with multiple internet service providers so that we can bundle those services together in case we have issues with one provider versus another. So that's another thing that we've got to worry about when it comes to turning up services in new locations. So those are my two answers.
Was your question relative to us as a provider or as what our customers are seeing?
You as a provider.
So I think one of the biggest challenges we have is that in spite of us being Big Blue and having a dog in most of the hunts around the technology, we are very much in an open environment and have every manufacturer, in fact, every level of technology from every manufacturer in one or more of our data centers. We've standardized on a set of what we think are going to be most standardizable architectures for delivering standard cloud services, but we offer such a broad portfolio of capabilities, from build it yourself to let IBM run everything, that managing the complexity of that portfolio has been probably the biggest pain point we've had. From a cost perspective, we've sunk millions of dollars into cloud designated data centers globally. So we are today operating 10 cloud-designated data centers in every major geography around the world, and provide a consistent cost structure and contract mechanism for customers who want to contract with us for those services on a global basis. Mm-hmm. That has been a huge investment that IBM has made, and we're just investing in more and more of those data centers and technologies.
I would say for Microsoft, we have, as I mentioned earlier, we've got a fairly broad portfolio from a cloud perspective, everything from SaaS offerings all the way through platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, and then on-premise private clouds. And one of the big challenges over the last few years, and it's not really been all that much of a secret, is trying to take the offerings that we've been successful with over the years and reorient the business models for cloud consumption patterns. So doing that is a challenge, but it's something that we've really embraced and I think are taking a leadership position in the industry in terms of figuring out how to take what were offerings geared toward on-premise and really creating cloud business models out of them. A second challenge that I see is the regulatory climate across the globe with things like data sovereignty and just having partners that would like to build multi-tenant applications and serve them up globally, but also knowing that there are countries that have very specific requirements around what you can and can't operate and where the data must reside. And I think that's probably a challenge that all of us up here are facing. And that regulatory climate continues to evolve very rapidly, and really is something that challenges us all. So,
yeah. I would agree with what everyone said. I did want to add that I think from a resource and time perspective, we spend a tremendous amount of time ensuring that we can meet certifications for our federal clients, for PCI, it's a big one, and these HIPAA things. So those take a ton of time and a lot of money. And then I guess the last thing I would just say is just in terms of, challenges, a lot of it has to do with our clients, right? And I just want to echo what William was saying, that, he was referencing sort of how open they need to be and how there's so many different platforms and there's so many different demands, and trying to meet those requirements while still staying very standardized and in a way that makes sense for us. I mean, one thing I will say is that we actually, IBM actually resells our services. So I can attest to them being extremely open because, they want to meet the needs of all of their clients. And so they look to different avenues to do that. And we do that in a far more limited way than they do. But it tends to be a challenge.
In the back.
Just on the other side of the coin that you kind of started to address, William, what are the customer pain points that you guys are seeing that they come to you with that you end up landing in a hybrid model?
So, customer pain points.
With particular reference to storage.
Yeah, so for customers, storage it's not so much storage as just data management. There's, depending on the application and the workload, you can require an awful lot of bandwidth. In fact, you can swamp the cost of your virtual data center services with what it costs just to move the data back and forth from wherever it resides today to wherever that service provider environment is going to be. And that frequently results in needing to use some level of application, database, or complete workload re-engineering, which is an unexpected cost associated with making the move to the cloud. On the positive side of that, if you've done it once and you do it smart, you re-engineer the data or the workload in such a way that multiple database, or I should say multiple applications or multiple workloads can take advantage of the re-engineering that you do. So you benefit from the upfront investment in whatever refactoring or re-engineering. But you really don't want to be moving as much data as you're used to doing in your own data center.
So I'll give you another a little customer example. Basically, we have a quasi-federal home mortgage company that's a big cloud customer of ours. They're not getting a lot of funding. Their data centers are full. They need more capacity. They've got licensing constraints around one of the vendors that were mentioned earlier that's not represented on the panel, and so they're pulling their hair out trying to figure out how to solve this technical challenge that they've got without having any real money to throw at it, and cloud becomes the answer. So what we bring to the table, and I sort of kind of plugged it without saying it earlier, is the idea of mixing virtualization that's associated with cloud typically with physical devices. And I would say about 80% of our customers take advantage of this capability. At its simplest form, it's the idea of a router integrated with the cloud so that you can cross-connect an MPLS connection back to your home office at its simplest form. So you're always sort of on net. The cloud looks like it's just another office or just another data center within your network. This particular customer went to the other extreme, right? So we actually engineered a standalone cloud platform for them so that they could use their not cloud-oriented licensing in a much more concise manner and save a ton of money in that regard. Leverage our pre-deployed multi-tenant platform for the application infrastructure itself, the web, app tier, and some of the reporting infrastructure that's required. And then we actually brought our Verizon Wireline brothers in and set up an arrangement where we could actually do a triangular-oriented replication of data so that we're replicating from primary to a backup as well as to their prim. And then we can actually roll from one place to another, and their developers have access to real-time data on their prim so they can continuously develop the application. So it's an interesting scenario. We solve so many business problems there, but it's not about bursting. It's not about having unused capacity on demand. It's about solving another business problem that this particular customer had. So,
not to oversimplify things, I think the biggest problem I run into with my clients is what they want to do and how much they want to spend. And storage is a big part of that too. Sometimes, for the clients that we have that may not be as sophisticated, they may have trouble scoping what they need, and they feel really comfortable saying, well, I want 10 terabytes. Well, they don't really want to pay for that. So a lot of it, that's where you have to be, as a service provider, extremely flexible in terms of scaling things back for them, allowing them to do things that maybe, we'll let you run for a couple months and we'll figure out what you need then, that type of thing.
Any more questions? Go for it.
Yeah. I don't know if this question is appropriate for this panel, but I'll ask it anyway.
We'll give it a go.
It might be too technical. It might be a little bit too
I wasn't there.
technical.
You didn't see me.
It might be a little bit too technical, but in attending a lot of these industry events, there's a lot of discussion right now on the topic of software-defined networking, and some of the very large cloud providers like Google. I would view Google as a software company that is getting into cloud, and software-defined networking basically promises that the network becomes dumb and open, and software can be written on top, and the network is just robust enough to implement it. So, first of all, do you think that's where this is all going? And if so, does it make it does it create an advantage for software-centric companies? I'm using Google as an example just because they're big and they developed Android. They're viewed as a software company. IBM could be Microsoft software company, whatever. But what's the perspective on SDN and the impact in the next 2-3 years, or is this just 5-10 years out?
So I'll just go real quick with an opinion because I'm not an expert at it. But SDN is here and it's coming in a bigger way. We've actually been using it on our side in our own internal way. In other words, our people have access to the provisioning, the networking components, and those kind of things. We're taking advantage of the features internally, and we're working on some things that will expose those features to our customers soon. So that's just my general comment, and I'm not really an expert at it yet, but it's coming. It's going to be big, a big component.
So for IBM, we differentiate between what we call cloud-centric and cloud-enabled workloads. And right now, 80% of the enterprise space is focused on stuff that existed 20 years before Google existed. And people are trying to figure out how to get maximum value out of that in a cloud. And so cloud-enabled workloads are probably not going to be able to take as much advantage of those software-defined networks, at least not initially, as what we would call cloud-centric applications. Cloud-centric applications, I agree completely with what Jim just said. SDN is here, and if you're able to refactor or start from the ground up on a new application that can take advantage of all the capabilities and promise that cloud provides, then you can get some real leverage out of it. But for most of our enterprise customers, that means either throwing away or doing significant re-engineering of the workload that exists today.
I'm glad you asked about SDN because I had it on my list and I left it off so you guys could ask questions. So thank you. Do we have any more questions? Oh, yeah, sure.
Is there a concern or is there an interest in consolidating security? For like an example, like the denial of service attacks we just experienced. And is there a concern around private clouds proliferating a problem there? Meaning they're in charge of their security, they could be inadvertently be part of the problem. Whereas if it's consolidated on a public cloud, it's more secure. Is that a concern?
Anyone want to tackle that?
Jim and I probably have the same answer, which is, the focus of our companies is not public. So we're less concerned about it, I think.
I would say that there are smart things that you can do in the public cloud to lessen the impact of denial of service attacks. And in many ways, folks developing their own private cloud infrastructure, whether it's an entire data center or whether it's a private cloud implementation, may not have as much expertise and be able to retain in-house the skill sets to understand how to best protect from those threat vectors.
Right.
And certainly the other folks on the panel here are probably involved in helping some set of those customers figure out how to prevent issues related to those threat vectors. But there are a whole class of folks that probably can benefit from the public cloud and relying on the experts' ability to do that in a way that scales, in a way that they may not be able to afford to do on their own.
But outside of experts, is there like a vision of where it's headed in terms of consolidating security globally, I would say?
Well, so I can talk, I don't know about globally, but let me talk from a Verizon Terramark perspective. So within all of our services that we offer, in the 50 data centers that we offer them from, And I've just been talking about one, the big Miami flagship is the one. But what we actually do, we've got commercial customers as well as federal customers. And we have public cloud, virtual private cloud, and private cloud platforms all within our data centers. All of these platforms leverage internet connectivity that is either private or shared. Usually it's actually shared because there's a lot more economies of scale associated with getting bandwidth on demand and paying for it and things like that. As such, we absolutely are 100% on focus on what's happening across that pipe, what kind of traffic is coming in. We see denial of service attacks coming aimed at one particular customer, and we can pluck that out of there and take care of it, eliminate it, feed it off to a different bit bucket, and vice versa. We can see things happening inside our environment that are headed out. One of the things that we do, even on our pure public cloud offering, we don't allow anyone to come in and just ask for an account without at least some sort of verification of who they are, that they're holding the credit card, that they're trying to swipe essentially online. And then our commercial customers and our federal customers, there's a contracting process. We know exactly what they're doing with the cloud. We know how they're going to use it. And so even though it's multi-tenant, we know all of the players on the cloud, and we weed through the players in the sales-oriented process to make sure that we're not bringing bad players onto the environment. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's sort of the approach that we take when it comes to security like that.
Yeah, it's, I think a lot of issues were raised around the need to go to the cloud because then you can consolidate security. So if people have machines in their homes, those things can potentially become part of botnets.
Sure.
Right. So there's an interest in moving away from that. There's interest in moving towards the cloud because then you can consolidate security. And I just had the impression that the original effort was first moved towards the public cloud, but then a lot of organizations said, you know what, I prefer private cloud. I prefer to do it myself, set up my own machines, have the same kind of services as a cloud, but I'm doing it myself. So that may be like a retrogression in the need to consolidate, or is there a desire to do that?
Well, I would suggest nothing's free, right? So even moving to the cloud, whether it's private or public, especially from an infrastructure as a service perspective, platform and software, you got some different things to think about. But from an infrastructure as a service perspective, an operating system is an operating system. It still has to be managed and patched, right? So you still have to worry about it, whether it's distributed across your coffee maker and your alarm clock and everything else, or it's all consolidated on one platform sharing common hardware to make it run. So you still have to worry about it. You still got to think about it. It does give you some unique benefits, especially by using a service provider, that we can monitor the choke points, if you will, or the points where the traffic comes together and goes out or comes in from the outside, and apply logic that is beneficial or asked for by one customer, but all the other customers are benefiting it. Being a Miami-oriented company, Terramark was, we used to have a phrase, a rising tide floats all boats, right? So we had federal agencies that were on the cloud, and we would see traffic attacking those federal agencies coming into the cloud platform that they're on. We could learn about those signatures during those attacks and throw those out into all of our cloud environments and protect ourselves from those signatures everywhere instantly. So that one attack leads to protection everywhere. So you get that kind of economy of scale. Now, will that ever become a scenario where we'll take those attacks and share them with the community at large? Yes, we already do that. We're already involved in a lot of different agencies where we swap information about attacks that we're seeing. We can't ensure or enforce that they're actually using the information to update signatures within their security devices, but at least we take that information and digest it and figure out what we need to do with it. So it's sort of happening, but there's not a cohesive process around it yet. Does that make any sense?
Sure.
Okay.
As long as your rising tide doesn't float all of your data centers.
No, it floats all the boats.
Yeah.
Data centers absolutely will.
So that brings us to the end. I want to thank our panel for showing up. Could you give them a round of applause, please? I think they did a great job.